According to Webster's dictionary, a Japanophile is one who especially admires and likes Japan, or Japanese ways. Today there seems to be a mania for all things Japanese, especially on the internet where, in colloquial terms, the modern Japanomaniac, the Weeaboo, has its home. But this modern Japan obsession is not something new or unique. It's happened before, when the land of the rising sun first showed its face to the world. Until Japan was forcibly opened in 1853, it and much of Asia was unknown to Europeans. Not until the 1700s did contact between Europeans and Asians begin in full. Earlier tales of the East were often distorted, exaggerated, or unreliable. While Marco Polo was one of the first Europeans to visit China, or Cathay as it was known to him, his account was riddled with errors, misinterpretations, and outright fiction. Still, despite such tales of questionable content, every piece of information, right or wrong, stirred European interests in the East. Even what 17th century Europeans knew about Asia was often misinformed. Besides being a place from which tea and tableware came, Asia was imagined as a fantasy land, often the fantasy of whoever spoke about it. The French philosopher Voltaire saw China as an enlightening kingdom of scholars. To Voltaire, China was a merocratic monarchy which European kingdoms should strive to be, a view obviously influenced by both his personal philosophy and the climate of the Enlightenment. Beyond Voltaire's interests, China was seen as an exotic empire of the Orient, especially in France where Chinese goods had become a fashion. Shops dedicated to the selling of Chinese goods and objects, chinoiseries, began to emerge. Through the fame of these items of luxury, most Europeans saw the East as a land of decadent empires, a primitive land open to European exploitation. The most secluded of these primitive nations to Europeans was Japan. Despite brief Portuguese contact in the 1600s and minimal Dutch trade through Dejima, Japan was largely isolated. As the country had been closed to outsiders for 200 years, and European empires had no interest in it, even in its isolation, Japan's urban culture thrived, and, thanks to technological trade with the Dutch, called Rangaku, Dutch learning, Japan was able to keep abreast of European developments. But, as a closed-off quasi-feudal state, it was unable to match European development and power. Japan's safe position would end in 1853. An American naval expedition forcibly opened the country to trade, then forced the country to sign embarrassing treaties which European powers would follow suit in doing, events that embarrassed Japan internationally, making the country seem weak by other powers, an impression the Japanese feared would open the country to European colonization. Still, besides humiliating trade treaties, Japan went largely unharmed. European interest was vested in China, and America had desired little more than a show of power and trade rights. Japan was seen as primitive, and it produced little of value, until the flow of trade brought new interests between Japan and the West. Fearing aggression, Japan quickly became interested in Western technology, launching the Iwakura mission to investigate Western technology and government in hopes of modernizing Japan, while Westerners quickly became interested in the strange goods that flowed from Japan, mainly those that depicted the life and culture of the Japanese, all rendered in styles completely alien to Europeans. Western technology to the east, and Eastern culture to the west. European interest in Japanese culture and art was not spurious or without context. The European art world of the 1800s was one still dominated by universities and high-class patronage. Few had yet to throw off the Baroque realism that had dominated the 1700s, with many artists growing tired of these standards, if not rejecting them, hoping to express themselves in new ways that reflected the rapid industrialization of Europe and the growing revolutionary fervor. This radical climate of new politics and society was open to new artistic influence. The emergence of both Impressionism and Symbolism showed European artists were looking for new avenues of expression, many believing old forms of art were unable to deal with new forms of subject matter. So, by pure coincidence, European artists began to turn towards the East. European exploits in the East had intensified interests in Asia. Newly established fields of anthropology and cultural studies brought new research. The Orient had been a mystical place to Europe, but now colonialism and modern technology could better examine it. Even beyond academia, books like Madame Chrysanthème, The Pink Notebook, and their derivatives brought popular interest to the East. Travelogues had always been popular in Europe, but now they could explore completely unknown cultures, with the book Promenades Japonaises showing Europeans a close view of Japan. A direct view European artists believed they found in Japanese woodblock prints. The Cult of Japan, as Philippe Berthet would later call it, would begin in 1856 with Felix Bracquemond, funnily enough, in what one may call the trash. Bracquemond discovered a copy of the Hokusai manga, a series of sketches by the Japanese artist Katsushika Hokusai, being used as packing material in his printer Delatre's shop. The manga would be the first major European artist's contact with Japanese art, a circumstance that would elevate the manga to a founding document of Japonism. Bracquemond would share it with many of his associates, drawing more interests into a gestating movement. The interest existed in such items, with many mistaking the items for not Japonisme, but Chiano Soirée, as, at first, most Japanese objects entered France through China shops, but general interest in Asia would soon develop into a Japan mania. What attracted so many artists was the style of the Ukioy-e, the Japanese floating world. Japanese artists, unlike Europeans, depicted the ordinary and daily and fantastic styles. While the establishment rejected Japanese art as simple and childish, many found great expression in both the simplicity and complexity of Japanese wood prints. These prints soon found an audience in Europe, with collectors searching high and low for them. The most remarkable being the Goncourt brothers, who best represented French interest in the works, as the two collected and displayed many Japanese wood prints, both for personal, political, and monetary reasons. These early Japonism displays drummed up interests in the movement, interest that was stoked by Japan's appearance at the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1867. This was the mysterious nation's first real impression to many Westerners who had only heard of it through books. One that lasted, as, after the exposition, the stand sold off much of its display, creating the first wave of legitimate Japonisme into France. This impression could be seen in the style of the Impressionists, as many artists hailed Japanese artists as the first Impressionist stylists. The fresh style of the Japanese ukiyo-e drew many adherents. So popular was the style, the art critic Jules Cariti dubbed the movement Japonisme, calling it the cult of Japan, a statement later supported by the Japanist Philippe Berthet and the high demand for woodblock prints in France. By 1875, Japonism had been established as a movement. But the 1880s would turn the niche interest into a wider obsession. Art expositions spread awareness of the style to the cultural masses. People became obsessed with Japanese-style fashions and flocked to Japan-style cafes. The style became so overdone, artists like Edgar Degas began to see it as a fad. Collectors soon became connoisseurs of only the finest Japonisme. When the exotic romance Madame Chrysanthème was published by Pierre Loti in 1887, inflaming passions for Japan, many turned against the image of Japan as a mystical kingdom of Asia. The depletion of woodblock prints in 1893 signaled the end of Japonism. For many, the movement had lost its luster, many artists having grown tired of it or done all they could with it. The publication of The Pink Notebook in 1893 by Felix Ragame rejected the romantic ideal of Japan, highlighting a wider backlash by those who had once supported the movement. Even the Japanese themselves had grown away from the famous styles of the ukiyo-e. Japan's exchange with the West had changed the nation. The politics of the Meiji Restoration and modernization had destroyed the lifestyle of the Edo period. A Western contamination many European artists had feared. Japan had begun to imitate the West in hopes of matching it. While Japonism's influence continued, the movement had largely died off by 1900. There was no longer such a demand for foreign art, as European artists adopted new styles for a new century, ones to prepare for the following grim decades of war. Japan was also no longer seen as a place of fantasy. Japan's victory over Russia in 1905 proved Eastern nations were not the decadent empires Europe had once seen them as. While Japonism died with the new politics of a new world, it had emerged in the same situation. Japonism had very much emerged from a rejection of tradition. The revolutions of 1848 had ignited new ideas and new radicals in Europe. While Japonism was not an outright political movement, radicals who often clashed in politics embraced the same ideals within Japonism. After France's defeat by Prussia in 1870 and the abdication of Napoleon III, both republic and monarchical factions were left searching. Republicans embraced Japonism for the ideals of education and diligence they saw in prince, many relating to Japan as a voice of the vanquished, seeing both France and Japan as nations abused by other empires. Reactionaries looked to Japan as a great feudal empire as France had once been. The Goncourt brothers famously seen Japan as an enlightened aristocratic nation, which France should strive to return to, a nostalgia for the glories of French absolutism. Most came to see Japan as a utopia of the individual. European artists saw the Japanese as being a primitive people in tune with nature and faith, a culture that elevated the life and worth of the individual. Neither political faction held complete sway over Japonism, but both seized on its ideals for this reason, hoping to restore the French to their past glory. One, industrialization and modernity had robbed of all people. Japonism, in this sense, was simply a rejection of the status quo. This is what so attracted artists to Japonism. The world they drew from Japanese works was one of a primitive utopia, an assumption many supported with the supposed feudal simplicity shown in European travelogues, a false impression that caused many to project upon Japan what they desired it to be. The misinterpretation Felix Regame set out to fix by publishing The Pink Notebook, but instead portrayed Japan as a secluded state of artists, creating an idea with its own issues. One ideal that was adopted by the famous Japanist, Vincent Van Gogh. Van Gogh had first been exposed to Japanese art through his art dealer brother Theo, an obsession that would seize both brothers as they would go on to acquire their own collections. Theo became interested by mere aesthetics, but Vincent seized upon Japanese art for both artistic and vague political reasons. Van Gogh saw Japan as a dream space upon which he could construct his own ideal world. To Van Gogh, Japan was a primitive socialist utopia of artists. In it, artists worked and supported each other with no need for credit or fame, an idea that would influence Van Gogh to establish his own failed commune of artists. But Van Gogh did not care for the reality of Japan. Van Gogh's Japan was a place untouched by the corruption of modernity, a place where time had stopped and people maintained a true connection to nature. Van Gogh constructed an identity from his idea of Japan. The country was but a symbol for what Vincent desired it to be. As many artists of the day had made Japan but an expression of their own dreams. So, the Japonism of the 1800s is nearly 200 years remote from us today, but that is the old Japonism of Japan as a primitive place of the past. Today, it seems many have turned towards a new Japonism, one where Japan is seen as a place of the future. The art of yesterday is now the entertainment of tomorrow. Both are interested in Japan for Japan, yet both still fall prey to misinterpreting the nation or having their own views color their ideas. That is not to say Japonism is unimportant. The innovations of its early embracers affect art even today, be it in color, style, or subject. You can even find commentary of Japan's own view of its image in the West, most famously an entire episode of Samurai Champloo dedicated to the subject of Japonisme, so it was not a forgotten movement of unknown eccentrics. Even its philosophy rings true today. Many today wonder the same thoughts Van Gogh wondered of East and West, the Orient and the Occident.